Hey, today we're going to talk about 5.3, the Green Revolution. So take a moment, check out the Enduring Understanding, look at the learning objective, pause the video, review the essential knowledge, and set up your Cornell notes. So again, this is a review. We discussed Thomas Malthus and his idea that the human population grows at an exponential rate, whereas the food production is arithmetically growing. And at some point, the food production cannot keep up with the population growth, and we will reach some sort of crisis. This can lead to famine and eventually, potentially wars. However, around the 1950s, we started to develop ways of increasing our food production. So then we started wondering, can we avoid this crisis? And that's really when the Green Revolution got its start. Got its start in the 1950s by a man named Thomas Borlaug. And you don't have to know that. But there are five concepts, or five components to the Green Revolution. And these five implementations really helped to shift our agriculture in a way that basically is making agriculture a factory. The first one is mechanization, the use of machinery instead of just pulling a plow behind a single farmer, not behind a farmer, behind a single tractor or a cow or other organism. First of all, mechanization is cost effective. You can actually cover a lot more area because you can have larger machinery and you can plow up more land instead of taking a single plow pulled behind a horse or a donkey or a cow or whatever. You can actually have a tractor driving a giant plow that can till up much more soil. However, driving these tractors require fossil fuel use, which is a contributor to climate change and biodiversity loss. The use of these tractors also will compact the soil. And when you push the soil down, you're reducing its water holding capacity, and eventually it can lead to soil erosion because of this soil compaction. Another idea was to develop monocropping, planting one crop at a time, and the use of genetically modified organisms. Now, the genetically modified organisms is when we take the DNA from one organism, place it into another. We will be discussing genetically modified organisms in another topic in a little bit more detail. But monocropping involves planting like one whole field of corn, one whole field of wheat, so on and so forth. We can get higher yields because we can also increase our profits. Because we're planting them at the same time, we are harvesting them at the same time, we're applying the same fertilizer, all of that stuff is done at the same. It can save time, which will increase our profits. And unfortunately, all of the organisms are genetically identical, so we will have lower overall diversity in that field, and it can contribute to the spread of diseases in the plants. Another idea was the use of fertilizers, and the fertilizers are beneficial because they provide key nutrients, which can in turn increase our profits and the food production. However, these fertilizers, if there is any runoff, it can lead to eutrophication, especially with the nitrogen-based fertilizers and the phosphorus-based fertilizers. If these fertilizers get into a body of water through runoff, eutrophication, remember, is the algal bloom. And then you have the algae will die, decompose, oxygen is consumed, leading to hypoxia and biodiversity loss. However, to prepare these fertilizers requires a huge amount of inputs of fossil fuels to produce these in a laboratory, because they are completely synthetic fertilizers. Irrigation, or applying water through sprinklers or other systems. This will increase the arable land. This word arable, what does that mean? The word arable just means farmable. It means land that is able to grow crops. So the middle of the Sahara Desert, not arable. A football field, in McCarran Park, the baseball fields, yeah, that's arable. It is arable. Doesn't mean that you're growing crops on it. It means where you can grow crops on it. Groundwater is depleted because we are sucking up the water through wells, and we will talk more about this in more detail. Also can lead to waterlogging and salinization. And again, I will also discuss these in another topic when we address irrigation specifically. And finally, the use of pesticides. Pesticides are and the suffix CIDE means to kill. Homicide kills a human. Pesticide kills a pest. But there can be different pests. There can be fungicide, which will kill a fungus. It can be rodenticide, which will kill a rodent. It can be herbicide, which will kill a plant. Insecticide. Yeah, there's other ones. I just can't think of them right now. But maybe if you let me know, I'll give you extra credit. Find another side. One of the benefits is this can increase the yield and increase the profits. However, it can harm non-target species. So just because you spray a pesticide, it doesn't mean all the bad insects are going to die and all the good insects are going to stay alive. That doesn't happen. You're going to kill the target insects. Most notably, you're going to be killing bees and other pollinators. And examples, and these are historical examples, DDT. And DDT was used as an insecticide. And eventually what happened is the DDT is an endocrine disruptor. We'll talk about that later on in the year. But the DDT got into the water supply and then it moved up the food chain. And bald eagles were consuming organisms that had DDT in them. And when the bald eagles laid their eggs, the eggs were very soft and the bald eagle chicks, the shells cracked and the chicks were never born. So the population of bald eagles was really decimated in the 1960s and 1970s. And then it has since come back because of huge humanitarian efforts and huge environmental pushes to maintain their population. So this green revolution, again, it's a shift in the agricultural practices that improves yields. It brought to light the energy subsidy. And an energy subsidy is basically the fossil fuel energy and the human energy input per calorie of food produced. So, for example, on average, for every 1 calorie, now a calorie is, the calorie that we use according to our nutrition label is actually a kilocalorie. In Europe, they'll use kilocalorie to describe everything. But 1 calorie that we use in America is a kilocalorie. Doesn't really matter. But we require 10 calorie energy input for every 1 calorie that is consumed. So this is on average. And there are certain foods that require even more input. Like beef production has a huge energy subsidy, and something like a grain production is going to have a much lower energy subsidy. And we'll be addressing that in future lessons. So most of this energy subsidy is because of the use of fossil fuels. We can use it in fertilizers, pesticides, the mechanization, the tractors and machinery, the irrigation, pumping the water, distributing the water. Also transportation of the foods to where they are going to be sold and or consumed. So the United States government recommends a specific amount of nutrients in our diet. And if we look at what we consume versus what the government recommends, it's not in sync. The government recommends having very limited amounts of sugar, oil, starch, and alcohol. Recommending having about, 20%, I don't know what this exact percentage is, but having about 20% of our nutrition should come from proteins. That's meat, dairy, nuts, legumes. Legumes, again, are beans and peas. Recommended that we have about maybe a third of our diet comes from vegetables and fruits, and 40% from grain. And grain can be wheat, barley, rice, things of that nature. Now, the government provides additional subsidies to farmers to produce these foods. So even though we're only recommended to have about 20% of our protein, of our calories should come from protein, the government supplies, this looks like it's about 60%. 60 or 70% of the government subsidies go to protein. And a lot of that is for meat production. In other words, this is why it's cheaper to order a hamburger at McDonald's than it is to get a bag of apples from Whole Foods. because even along the same lines, the government does not subsidize the amount of grain. So the grain production, the wheat, the barley, the rice, the government is not providing as much money to farmers to produce those. So it makes more sense for farmers to raise meat products because they're getting more money back from the government. So there's not as much of a threat in case there's like any sort of disaster, that like there's no economic impact on the farmer if there is any sort of disaster, because the government's going to bail you out. But another thing, the government is also heavily subsidizing the production of sugar, oil, starch, and alcohol, which means it's a lot easier to buy, a cheap bag of potato chips than it is to get a healthy, bunch of broccoli at the supermarket. And that's really upsetting, because it's not only bad for the obesity epidemic, because we're pushing Americans to eat the wrong types of foods, but it's also not really sustainable environmentally. And we're going to talk about this. Everything that I've addressed today on this topic of the Green Revolution, all of these 5 components of the Green Revolution, they're pretty bad. And throughout this unit, we're going to talk about why they're bad and then how to make them better. Okay, so hopefully by the time that this unit is done, we might have a better idea of how we can improve our diet to be more sustainable. So for FRQ practice, I would like you to describe one environmental advantage and one environmental disadvantage of the Green Revolution. I thank you for your attention. I know that this was a lot of information. I hope that this was informative. I will see you soon.